Hi everyone, my name is Dan Adler and I'd like to welcome you to my new series about active listening in jazz. Now, what is active listening in jazz? That's what we'll try to go over here. If you think that jazz is sort of cool music to have in the background, chill, anything that is sort of a good relaxation type music, music to drink your glass of wine with, or music, or romantic music, or that's all cool. But I want to tell you that there's another whole way of listening to jazz. And if you've ever been at a jazz club and have not known what you're supposed to be listening for, that is what this series is supposed to be about. Now, it's not for musicians. Musicians spend their whole, especially jazz musicians, spend their whole life trying to figure out this music. What is the history? What is the theory? How do they get it out there? How to express yourself? All these things. But for some reason, there isn't that much information out there about active listening in jazz. And what I mean by that is that there are millions of books out there, even books for non-musicians about jazz. You can get online series. You can learn the history of jazz. You can learn a lot about, you can even watch the Ken Burns series about jazz. And through all of that, you get a lot of different aspects of jazz. But for some reason, no one has yet made a series that is very specific to try to answer the question, if you are now in a jazz club or if you are listening to jazz albums for the first time, what should you be listening for? What are you supposed to be following? What are those people doing? And I get that a lot when I bring people. I live in New York City, so I try to help my friends get to jazz clubs as much as possible, especially people who are visiting. And I often see that after a little while they start to wander, they check their phones, you know, you've all seen that or they think that jazz clubs are made for background conversations. So, and they're kind of surprised by the people who are sitting there and are actually following along and are into it. And so, also, I think that people just have not yet really gotten the information about what is the intellectual process that is involved in jazz. And what I mean by that is that the jazz musicians that are on stage or playing to you from a recording are going through an intellectual process that in many ways is unique. It's unique to that moment, and it's unique to their capabilities, and it's unique to the conversation that's going on between them. And it's also unique to the challenge that they set up for themselves. And that challenge is something that is not always understood. The intellectual process, the abstraction process. I talk to a lot of people who are kind of in areas of abstraction like programming or mathematics or physics, or anyone who has sort of a scientific background or some kind of area of endeavor where they really appreciate dealing with challenges. But the challenges of jazz have not been well explained, I feel. What are the people that are on stage dealing with, and how do you put that into terms that are not only meaningful to musicians? So before I get started with this, I want to tell you a couple of words about myself. My name is Dan Adler. I play guitar I try to play jazz. I've been playing for many years. I've recorded a few albums. I've recorded an album with Grant Stewart and Philip Stewart, Dimitri Kolesnik, Richard Samuels. That was my first album, All Things Familiar. I recorded an album with Joey DeFrancesco and Byron Landham called Back to the Bridge. And my recent one is called Friends on the Moon, and that's with Arnon Palti, who helped write half of the music, and Donald Vega, the great pianist, and Byron Landham, the great drummer. So that's kind of what, that's my musical side. And I also have another side. So besides kind of reading up on Coltrane or let's see what I have here, David Baker, a great book on jazz improvisation. Jerry Coker, another great book on jazz improvisation. Miles Davis, of course, the music of Miles Davis is legendary. Dave Liebman. We have a million books that are made for musicians and are talk about jazz in all its complicated details. But I'm also interested in programming. So together with those books, you might find me reading books about functional programming, books about machine learning, TensorFlow, books about compilers, all sorts of stuff in that area. So the computer scientist in me wants to find the rules and the processes that go on behind jazz music, the creation of jazz music, and to somehow be able to phrase it in ways that will be meaningful to people. Now, some people say, well, the proof is in the pudding. All you really need to know is to listen to the final result, and that's all you need to know. And you hear that a lot from musicians. And I think that's helpful, and that's obviously, in the end, that's obviously the real test. But what happens, I think, is in this culture right now, people are very interested in, I mean, look at cooking shows. How many cooking shows are there? People are interested in how you get to a result. People are interested in what is the process that a chef is going through to reach that final result, which is tasty and to them. They don't want to go to culinary school, but they want to understand the process. And I think you see that with a lot more areas right now, and people are interested in understanding what is the process that the person is going through. And now I may not be the most qualified to give this information. Not I'm a jazz musician, but I'm not one of the greatest jazz musicians. I'm certainly not not in the first tier. But what I am seeing is I'm seeing that there is a missing link. There's a missing amount of information out there about what is going on stage during a jazz concert or in a club or when you're listening to something. What is going on? What are the people dealing with? What is it that they're trying to convey to you, and are you getting it? Now, when you go and watch movies about jazz musicians, the movie about Charlie Parker, Bird, the movies about Chet Baker, Bill Evans, all that, they'll talk about the creative process, and then there'll be a lot about drugs, and there's the whole story around the experience of African Americans in the United States, and all of those things come together to give you some feeling of something that you need to know historically, but is not an intellectual process. Somehow in all of these films and in all of these documentaries and in all of these books, what you get is you understand that there's a creative process going on, and you understand that there is something super special about these people, but they're not talking about the type of geniuses that these people are and what it is exactly that they're trying to do. And when you don't understand that, you kind of look at it and say, okay, it's a bunch of drug addicts that are doing something creative. I don't know what they're doing. I understand the history. I understand how it evolved. I understand maybe the styles, but I'm just not interested because I cannot actually penetrate what it is that they're doing. So I want to help you try to do that. And actually, if more qualified or if other people who are in the jazz educational areas will come out with even better videos on these areas, that's really my goal. My goal is for more people to talk about this. What is the intellectual process that's going on? How can I explain it to you in such a way that you will actually enjoy listening to jazz next time you go to a club? Jazz music in New York is one of my favorite activities, and when I go around, I see a lot of people who are engaged, and then I see a lot of people who are in the club, but they're not engaged with what's going on. And part of, I think, our responsibility as musicians and as people who really care about this genre is to explain what it is they should be caring about. So that's what I'm going to try to do here, and I am going to try and Also interview some of the great musicians that are around and ask them these questions. What do you think is what should people be listening to? And I want to make it as specific as possible. So we'll go through, in this series, we'll go through the roles of each instrument. We'll go through some of the things you should be aware of when you're listening to jazz. We'll go through some of the definitions of the types of rhythmic devices that people are using. We'll try to understand what exactly they're trying to do. We'll even try to understand the whole idea of building melodies on chord changes without getting too much into the technicalities. The goal is not to make you into a jazz musician, but just to give you enough information to be able to enjoy the music at a higher level. So the first thing I will actually try to do is give you an example that is very concrete and is something I've seen Chick Corea and other musicians do many times, and this is the sing-along. So the reason I really like the sing-along is that what it does is it demonstrates, and that's kind of what Chick Corea is trying to do in it, I'm assuming, is to show the audience how they should be already listening, and how probably most people who are active listeners are listening. So what he does there is he gives the audience a phrase and they sing it back. And if you know anything about the way jazz musicians actually train themselves, ear training and transcribing is exactly this process of listening to what somebody is doing, usually someone who's a famous jazz player, listening to what they're doing, trying to mimic it, and trying to understand how the phrase works, and then trying to use it in some other context. And so when you listen to the sing-along, you see how he is kind of training them in a way to listen and be able to repeat. And it also shows that I think musicians and non-musicians alike have this ability. You have this ability. You learn songs all the time. You hear things, you repeat them. And this idea of following along in your mind is the key thing that is demonstrated in this sing-along. And also the way that complexity evolves. So starting simple, relating to melodies, and all of these things, which we'll talk about in further episodes. But the main thing I think to notice here is that this is a capability that most people, probably you currently, already have, and that this is a very important key when you are trying to follow along with what the musician is doing, what the soloist is doing. That's the first part. Later on, you'll learn to hear about the other parts that are going on at the same time. But what is the soloist doing, and could I repeat that? And is he going to do something that's going to surprise me? So what you'll see him do is he'll take a phrase and then he'll change it a little bit, and some kind of a surprising element will come in, and then you'll be thinking about it in a slightly different way. And then he'll take it and make it a little bit too complicated for you to sing. But at that point, you can see how the instrument kind of transcends the voice and the ability to create melodies that you can't always sing. So let's listen to the Chick Corea sing-along, and I'll see you after that. And it gets more complicated as he goes along. He's starting them simple. Da 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 da. You can do it too. The phrases are very simple, and it's on one phrase at a time. But he's going over the form of the song, and this is the song Spain. All right, the phrases are getting longer. And the audience is following. Now he's messing with them. This is part of the humor in it. But he's not giving up. Back to simple. A little surprise. The phrase goes down, then it goes up. Now he's back to the melody, which the audience knows. All right. And that's how he gets his audience to sing along. Okay, so that's been our first episode of active listening in jazz. And in the next episode, we'll talk about counting and form and how to listen for what is going on overall in the music. So thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.